Welcome back. It's time to learn some more Python with Jordan and Jackie. Today, we're going to cover the first of, I think, 3 videos on data types. And just a little note, this might be the first time you've seen us use the mu IDE on one of these videos. Works a little bit differently to Replit. You need to plug it into a microcontroller so it can actually run Python. Watch our standalone video about mu if you need to know more.
Awesome. So, Jordan, what are the data types in Python?
That's a very good question, Jackie. Python actually has quite a lot of data types. The only way I could find out is I went to Google and I Googled Python data types. And this first link that comes up to W3 Schools is quite a reputable coding resource. And so here we go. We see that it has blah, 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 data types. And here we have this nice little table.
Awesome.
So there's quite a lot, aren't there?
Yeah, strings, integers, int, integers, floats.
Complex.
List, double.
Wow, good grief.
Yeah.
It's all a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
Well, don't you worry, because firstly, we're going to ignore about half of them, because some of them are pretty niche. And today, we're just going to focus on the basic elementary ones that just hold one piece of data. So that would be the int, the float, the bool, and the none type. Which is a bit of a weird one. Yeah.
Let's start with something I feel more comfortable with, int, float. Yeah.
Let's do that. So over here, I've done some preparation.
Okay. Yeah.
I type so fast. Okay, so you've seen us do all of this stuff in previous videos. You know, when you want to declare a variable, you just type your variable name, you say equals, and then you set it to something. And I don't know, maybe some of you have used languages like C++ in the past, where you have to actually tell it what type a variable is. Python's a little bit more chilled out. It just looks at what data you put there and goes, okay, I'm that. And if you try to change it into something else later on, it'll be like, okay, I'm that now.
Okay, so if I put a 5 in my variable, what type is that?
So 5 is an integer because it's a number that does not have a decimal point.
All right, so difference between integer and float, a whole number or a decimal number.
Yeah, and so incidentally, I could type 5.0, at which point it still has a value of exactly 5, but now it knows that I want it to be a floating point number because I've put the point there.
All right, fair, clear.
You've seen us do booleans before. It's the keywords false and true with a capital F and T. So here I've made boolean, variable 3 a false boolean. And here's this weird one, none. Yeah, it's very useful occasionally. You'll notice it's a keyword like false and true, capital first letter. It also goes the darker green in this IDE. Basically, that is saying it's kind of a way of declaring a variable that is empty, that has no data but still exists. We'll see 1 or 2 things here about what it does, but mostly we'll come back to it later when we're dealing with objects and classes.
All right, so it's a way to create a variable, but we don't put anything in there yet.
Yeah, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so here I've got my variables, and here I've just got a bunch of prints. So let's see what happens. Now, because this is mu and I'm running it on a microcontroller, there's no run button. I just have to click save to resave that onto my microcontroller, and it then automatically runs.
Yeah.
I put the new line print here just to make it a bit more visible. So we see an integer, value 5, a float, value 10.2, a boolean, value false, and a none, value none.
None. Okay.
So that behaves pretty much as you'd expect, right? It just shows those values.
Yeah.
But what happens if
we combine them, right?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Maybe you are not yet familiar with this, which is syntax for commenting out a whole bunch of lines at once. So let's put these ones back in. So here I'm going to see what happens if I add an integer and a float. I'm going to see what happens if I add an integer and a boolean, integer and a none, and then I'm going to try to do a boolean operation, an integer and a boolean.
Okay, right. So you save again, it runs the program, and we see that in the bottom of the screen. And there's an error.
Okay, so it started off just fine. So there's our integer, our float, our boolean, and our none. Unsurprisingly, if we add an integer and a float, we just get
15.2.
Yep.
Sounds good.
10.2 plus 5. maybe not surprising, but if you add an integer and a float, what you get is a float. But it is just as you would expect, the sum of those two things. Integer plus boolean. That's a weird one.
So that means 5 plus 0, I guess.
Yeah, indeed. So this is something we haven't talked about that much yet, but traditionally, perhaps, the way booleans have been represented is just as 0 and 1. 0 is false, 1 is true. And even though we have these nice handy keywords, like false and true, which just makes it all a little bit more obvious and intuitive, under the hood, a false is basically still just a 0, and a true is basically still just a 1. So 5 plus 0 is 5. And incidentally, if we change that
To true, then we should get something around 6.
we should indeed get something around
Yeah,
6.
yeah.
And there we do. Okay, now it's all looking a little bit messy because of this traceback file. So these sorts of errors, when one is coding, you will see quite often, and they will always be frustrating and often quite hard to figure out.
But we have, so very typical for this type of
Issue,
context, type error.
And it's telling us that the type error is on line 17. So basically, it does not like me trying to add a none to an integer. Okay, well, lesson learned. Nuns are pretty much useless for anything except holding a place for later. So let's delete that one and try that again. And what do we have now? Okay, so now it's run happily. So all of our values, the integer plus the float, the integer plus the boolean. And now here's a pretty cool one. So an integer and a boolean, so that's a Boolean logic and going on, it's evaluating as true.
Right. And so would that mean that any numbers would be true?
My understanding is that any non-zero number, if you try to do a Boolean operation with it, will evaluate as true. It just occurs to me, I don't know, what about negatives?
Okay. So -5, is it still
Yeah.
true? Yeah. And
Yep.
so just for the sake of it, if we put a 0 here,
Let's do exactly that.
we end up with
Yeah, and then we
not
get
true, we get
Ah.
0.
Interesting. Yeah, okay, but 0 is basically...
So, but I think that proves our point that
Yeah.
when we play with types, it's always good to double check not only in the doc, but in practice.
Yeah, what it actually does.
yeah.
And I mean, the fact that that says 0 instead of false is fine, because if that was in an if statement, it would
Still
still
false.
have the expected outcome.
Yeah.
And speaking of if statements, let's just delete these guys to get them out of the way. And then let's bring back in these lines over here that I wrote earlier. So here we're just explicitly seeing what happens if you use something that, something that isn't a Boolean, where you would normally use a Boolean. Variable 1 is our integer, variable
5.
2 is our floating point, and we're saying if variable 1, in the way that you would go if Boolean. So if variable 1 is treated as true, then we'll see this over here printed, and the same for that one there. And let's give it a try. Yeah,
Both of them
sort of true.
So if 5,
Yeah.
and that means that it's a true. Yeah.
Yeah, so pretty weird, you know, maybe a slightly more advanced sort of concept that there are times where that can be super convenient and make your programming much easier, but just be aware of it that numbers will often evaluate as Booleans if you try to evaluate them as Booleans.
And as we demonstrated with the 0 for the Boolean, if var1 equals 0, then that should be equal to a false.
Indeed. And so, in fact, what we can do here is go if 0,
Yeah.
let's see if 0, I mean, I think we can guess. And let's
1.
try if
Yeah.
1. Is 1 sort of true?
And so
And what we see is that 1 is sort of true
But not
and 0 is not.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we should leave it there for today. We will be back with another video on longer compound data types.
list and
Yeah, lists
dict.
and dicts and strings are the ones we're going to cover.
Indeed.
And then we're also going to do a video on data type conversions.
Indeed.
Okay, enough for today. Thanks for your attention. We'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.